The Electric Light Orchestra, otherwise known as ELO for quite a lot shorter, are and were an art pop art rock band from Birmingham in the UK. You've probably heard of them. They were formed by several members of a band called The Move in 1970, initially under the leadership of a guy called Roy Wood, who then went and formed a band called Wizard. He left during the recording of their second ELO album, and Jeff Lynne took over and quite famously has pretty much led the band since. So they soon had a settled lineup which continued until the splintering that happened in the late 80s. So it would be easy to think that there was one faction led by Bevan, who had been the bassist for quite a long time, and one led by Jeff, but that is a huge simplification. Bev led a band that carried on when Jeff took a break, which at times was called ELO Part 2, at times was called The Orchestra, at times was called Orchestra with a K, and at times was called ELO. But Jeff reformed a band called for a long time ELO, and then more recently Jeff Lynne's ELO, to distinguish it from the other version that was going on. At what point it was possible for two bands called the ELO to be performing in different towns on the same night. I had the pleasure myself to see ELO Part 2, led by Bev Bevan, twice. They were simply incredible. I absolutely adored those evenings. And I have been a long-time fan for ELO ever since I heard Mr. Blue Sky when I was 11. Their sound started by being an experiment in using classical strings in rock. The strings element continued all the way through. Their main violinist for quite a long time was a guy called Mick Kaminsky, who was a prominent member. They also use synths a lot, and particularly well. If you follow the Jeff Lynne strand, they have had 15 studio albums. Hi, my name's Dan, and this is one of the reviews that I am doing that comes under the category and into the playlist called Dan's Picks. So this channel is almost all about me reviewing a list of albums called the 3,000 Greatest Albums of All Time, as proposed by a site called Acclaimed Music, who have created the list by amalgamating critics' lists and doing some kind of complicated algorithm. They've done a great job, and I've set myself this amazing challenge of reviewing them all. I'm about 840 through, but I've gone from the bottom and I'm moving upwards. So it's taken me 2 1/3 years so far. This is probably an 8 to 10 year job altogether. That's not important for this video particularly, but to say that sometimes I step out of that. So sometimes I do request reviews, and if you want to request a review, just leave a comment on any of the videos on the channel. I don't absolutely promise I'll review everything that's requested, but I have done most so far. I do occasional new releases when there are things that particularly interest me. But some of them are just stuff that I like and I've known for a while and I've picked out. And there are 3 categories there. So one category is what I call criminally missing. So that's albums that I think really should have been on the list, but weren't. And I'm annoyed about it. I don't get that annoyed. Another one I call hidden gems, which, the name might suggest they're ones that I think not that many people know I really like. And so I want to bring to attention. And then there's the ones that fall in the gap in the middle. So I've chosen to call them Dan's Picks. So it's an album that I don't think is hugely well known internationally, not even particularly well known in the UK, but I don't think it's a kind of hidden album that people go, what? What's that? So here we go. So ELO, Electric Light Orchestra, were huge in the UK a bit later than this. So at the end of the 70s, early 80s, they were absolutely all over the charts there. They particularly broke through with their album Out of the Blue, although they'd had some success before that. This is before that. This is the second album by ELO. So in the About the Act introduction, I talked about some of the comings and goings here. This album is effectively the point where Jeff Lynne takes over from Roy Wood. And Roy Wood left early on in the process of recording this album. So at this point, they're not quite what I think of as the classic lineup for ELO, because the bassist isn't yet a guy called Kelly Groucutt. He came in 1975, and all of their really well-known albums had Kelly Groucutt as the bassist. This bassist here is Mike Dalbaker. I don't know if that's pronounced right, and he did several albums with them. Frankly, I'd say the first album, personally, I thought it was a bit of a mess, and I'm not a huge fan of it. I very rarely listen to it. I consider it to have been an attempt to make rock with classical instruments, and it kind of, for me, fell flat. There is something that I about the first album that I'm going to mention, which is a fact that I absolutely love, which is that in the UK it was a self-titled album. It was the album The Electric Light Orchestra. In the US, it was titled No Answer. And the reason why it was titled No Answer is that somebody at United Artists was told to ring up somebody in the UK and ask them what the name of the album was. And the note they made was No Answer, because nobody answered the phone. And then that became the name. Somebody misinterpreted that as that's the name of the album, and so it became billed as No Answer in the States. Back to this album. Finally, I'm actually going to review the album. I've been so distracted by other things. I would say that, I mean, obviously, it's going to be an album that I love, which is why I'm reviewing it in my, the dance pick stuff. I would say it's a glorious album, but it's not perfect. There's just a little bit of a fly. I'll come to that a bit later. Excuse me. So it's expansive rock. It's mostly about kind of imaginative settings. Musically, it blends rock with classical strings and synth, and they're starting to get this kind of trademark bassy sound. Sometimes it's almost classical. In fact, there are some bits of it that you could say are straight up classical here. There's lots of textures, light and shade. The best known track on this album is Roll Over Beethoven. So this charted as a hit in the UK, and is a cover of Chuck Berry's Roll Over Beethoven. But the album version of this is expansive and just, I mean, it goes on and on. But it keeps switching between classical and doing Beethoven's Fifth, and in rock and roll, and it kind of blends and goes backwards and forwards, and then becomes this great big kind of set of music that just expands and kind of keeps changing and exploring. That's the word that I'm looking for. Other tracks, there's a track about, there's various fantasy stuff. There's a track about war. There's a track about pollution. And there's a couple of tracks that are just kind of fantasy, basically. But it's all about the music, which is great. So lots of stuff that I love here. It's definitely kind of it somewhat in the prog rock world, in terms of expansive. I'm going to keep using this word stuff. There's some great rock going on in here, but my criticism prediction is that the production, that's where I've got that word coming out, is muddy. Particularly the vocals, but the rest of it is not crisp, and that I mean, it's when was it recorded? 1973, is that right? I should have that written down, but I haven't quite got that here in front of me. Um, Recorded in the UK at that time. In the UK, we had some really good studios, and things were sounding really good often, and for something of this kind of feel, I would have expected it to not be quite so muddy. And particularly the vocals. So ELO did have a habit for quite a few years of cutting the top end of the vocals off, which kind of softens all the consonants in it, but it makes it quite muddy. They eventually came out of that, but they were still doing this several albums later. Um, so if you're used to late 70s and early 80s ELO, I would say that this is almost unrecognizable. It feels like you can hear the seeds of some of their later stuff in here, But if you kind of Discovery onwards, it really is very dissimilar to this. And it's a very different kind of feel and very different kind of band. I do love the later stuff, but I also love this album. And it is an album I've listened to many times over the years. It's quite often a kind of casual, what do I feel like? Yeah, let's have ELO too. Listen to it, and it just kind of draws me in and takes me along with it. I've gone on at length. I'd love to know what you think of this album. If you haven't come across it before, have a listen and let me know. And if you do know it, then I'd love to know what you think. So please do that by leaving me a comment. And that's it from me for now.
She came up from the country with a smile for everyone. She left her blue horizon just to find another home. A lonely girl who traveled many days. Lonely heart.